Hyon hui, From Agent to Exile. Part 1. Early Years in a Divided Peninsula. Born on January 27, 1962, in the city of Kaesong, Hyon hui entered the world at a time when Korea was deeply divided between two diametrically opposed ideologies and locked in an unresolved war that had left the peninsula physically and politically scarred. Kaesong, though historically part of unified Korea and once its capital during the Goryeo dynasty, had become a border town under North Korean control following the Korean War. Her birth into a politically elite family during such turbulent times shaped not only her upbringing but also laid the groundwork for the extraordinary life she would lead. Soon after her birth, Kim's family relocated to Pyongyang, the capital city of North Korea. Pyongyang was not just any urban center, it was the epicenter of the Kim dynasty's totalitarian grip and the nucleus of the state's carefully constructed image of ideological purity and national pride. Her father was a high-ranking career diplomat, a status that afforded the family certain privileges unavailable to the average North Korean citizen. His position took the family abroad, and one of the most formative of these diplomatic postings was in Cuba, another communist nation aligned with North Korea's revolutionary ideals. Though Kim was still young during their time in Havana, the experience gave her fleeting, filtered exposure to life beyond the rigid structures of North Korean society, exposure that most North Koreans would never experience. From a young age, Kim displayed an impressive array of intellectual and social capabilities. She excelled in her academic studies, consistently earning top marks and praise from her teachers. But her talents were not confined to the classroom. She also stood out in extracurricular activities, ranging from music and theater to athletic pursuits and public speaking, all of which were rigorously monitored and often politically infused in North Korea. Students like Kim, who combined intelligence, discipline, and patriotism, were often flagged for higher roles within the regime, particularly those requiring loyalty and a carefully cultivated public image. Her early talents were soon recognized by the state's cultural officials, and she was placed on a track that would eventually merge propaganda with performance. She was selected and trained as an actress, a significant role in North Korea, where the performing arts are seen not only as a source of entertainment but also as powerful vehicles for spreading the regime's ideology. Her most notable accomplishment during this time was starring in the first North Korean film to be produced in Technicolor. The use of this technology was itself symbolically reflected the regime's attempt to showcase modernity and artistic advancement to both domestic and foreign audiences, even as the country remained economically isolated and technologically behind. Kim's role in the film served a dual purpose. It bolstered her public image and brought her to the attention of North Korean leadership circles, including those in intelligence. At just 10 years old, Kim was chosen to represent the youth of North Korea at a major inter-Korean diplomatic event. During the 1,972 talks between the North and South Korean governments, an unprecedented moment in the peninsula's tense history, Kim was selected to present flowers to a senior South Korean official. This event was more than a ceremonial gesture. It was highly choreographed political theater, designed to convey a message of peace and unity, even as deep distrust and military tensions simmered beneath the surface. The choice of young Kim for this public-facing role underscored her value as a symbolic figure, poised, articulate, and photogenic child who could personify North Korea's future and charm foreign diplomats while strictly adhering to the script provided by her government. Upon completing her secondary education, Kim was offered entry into one of the most prestigious academic institutions in North Korea, Kim Il-sung University. Named after the country's founding leader, the university was a training ground for future government officials, diplomats, and elite members of the party. However, her time there was short-lived. She soon transferred to the Pyongyang University of Foreign Studies, another elite school but one with a different focus: the study of foreign languages and cultures. This institution was known for training future intelligence agents, diplomats, and translators, those who would interact with the outside world on behalf of the regime. Kim chose to study Japanese, a decision that may have seemed unusual on the surface, given North Korea's historical grievances against Japan and its ongoing political hostility toward Tokyo. But within the strategic framework of the regime, Japanese fluency was highly valuable. Japan was not only a neighbor with considerable geopolitical influence, but it was also home to a significant Korean diaspora and was a nation North Korea both resented and needed to manipulate for various covert operations. The decision to study Japanese was no coincidence. It was the first signal that Kim's future would diverge dramatically from that of her peers. However, she would not be permitted to simply complete her studies and move on to a traditional diplomatic role. Just as she began to immerse herself in the rigors of academic life, Kim was quietly approached by government officials from one of the country's most secretive arms, the North Korean Intelligence Agency. She had been selected for a higher calling, not as an artist, not as a diplomat, but as an elite spy. The rationale behind her selection was chilling in its precision. She had the language skills, the intelligence, the poise, and most importantly, the psychological pliability to be molded into a covert operative who could serve the supreme leader's geopolitical ambitions without question or hesitation. This covert recruitment marked the end of Kim's relatively normal youth and the beginning of a transformation that would see her adopt a new name, a new identity, and a new mission that would eventually culminate in one of the most devastating acts of terrorism in East Asian aviation history. She had not yet left the classroom, but her path was now set, leading her away from textbooks and film reels and toward a dangerous world of false passports, coded messages, and deadly missions. Part 2. Into the Shadows. The Making of a Spy. Kim Hyon hui's induction into the clandestine world of North Korean espionage marked a profound departure from the artistic and academic path she had initially envisioned. Plucked from her university studies in Japanese at the Pyongyang University of Foreign Studies, she was quickly absorbed into the tightly sealed and brutally efficient machinery of the regime's covert operations program. Her transformation from student to spy was not a matter of choice, but of mandate, imposed by a state that regarded personal identity and free will as expendable in the service of political objectives. As soon as she was recruited, Kim was told she would no longer exist as the girl she once was. Her past, her name, and even her ambitions would be rewritten to suit the state's needs. She was immediately assigned a new identity. Okay, Hua, a name meant to signify rebirth under the auspices of the Supreme Leader's intelligence apparatus. Her training commenced in a compound located on the outskirts of Pyongyang, a place she would later refer to as the Keumsung Military College. The name, strangely enough, has never been verified or corroborated by other sources, adding a veil of mystery to the origins of this elite training facility. The compound was heavily guarded and completely isolated from the outside world. Once inside, trainees were no longer allowed to maintain contact with their families. They lived, breathed, and trained solely for the missions ahead. The training program lasted an intensive 7 years. It was meticulously designed to break down and reforge every aspect of a recruit's mental and physical being. This was not mere boot camp, it was psychological re-engineering. Every moment was structured. Every activity had a purpose. Days began before dawn, with rigorous physical conditioning, long-distance running, martial arts, and strength training that pushed the limits of physical endurance. Instructors demanded total obedience and punished hesitation or failure without mercy. The goal was to develop operatives who were not only physically resilient but also mentally conditioned to carry out commands without question. Parallel to the physical training, Kim was immersed in an academic and ideological curriculum that covered espionage theory, communications, sabotage tactics, disguise, and foreign cultures. She was trained in the use of various codes, encryption methods, and radio communication protocols. She learned to pick locks, forge documents, and create false identities down to the smallest personal details. Perhaps most chillingly, she was trained to kill using everything from knives and firearms to bare hands and everyday objects. A crucial component of her training was language acquisition. For 3 years, Kim was rigorously trained in Japanese, but not in the manner of a conventional student. Her lessons focused not only on vocabulary and grammar, but also on dialect, cultural behavior, etiquette, and the small nuances that marked a native speaker from an outsider. Her Japanese tutor was an enigmatic woman known to Kim as Hyon hui. Kim would later reveal that this was the assumed identity of Yaeko Taguchi, a Japanese woman abducted by North Korean agents years earlier. Taguchi had been forcibly brought to North Korea to serve the regime's espionage program, training agents like Kim to convincingly impersonate Japanese nationals. Though their relationship began within the constraints of a prison-like system, Kim came to view Taguchi as a deeply intelligent and caring person of the few figures during her training who offered human warmth. Later in life, Kim would speak of Taguchi with great emotion and sorrow, expressing guilt for having been part of the machine that kept Taguchi from her homeland and family. The psychological conditioning was relentless. Trainees were bombarded with propaganda films that painted South Korea, the United States, and their allies as morally bankrupt and militarily aggressive. These films reinforced the message that the spy's mission was not just political, it was sacred. Trainees were taught to view themselves as soldiers in an existential battle, tasked with defending the homeland through deception, sabotage, and, if necessary, assassination. At the culmination of her training, Kim faced a series of final examinations that were as elaborate as they were dangerous. One of the most challenging tests involved infiltrating a mock foreign embassy within the training compound. She was required to memorize critical documents, bypass layers of security, and return undetected, simulating a real-world mission with high stakes and no margin for error. Upon successfully completing her domestic training, Kim was sent to Macau to add yet another layer to her skill set: the Cantonese language. Macau was a strategic choice. As a bustling trade hub under Portuguese administration, it was a city teeming with cultural intersections: Chinese, Portuguese, and Western. Here, Kim was immersed in daily life outside the sealed borders of North Korea. She lived among locals, interacted with merchants, and was trained to pass as a Chinese national. This phase of her training aimed to refine her adaptability. She learned how to navigate supermarkets, use credit cards, and behave in social spaces like discos and restaurants, places that did not exist in the hermetically controlled society she came from. These seemingly mundane activities were, in fact, vital. They prepared her to blend in during overseas operations where even a minor cultural misstep could expose her identity. Following her training in Macau, Kim was partnered with an older male operative named Kim Sung-il, though this too was an alias. She was told he would act as her handler and traveling companion. The two began a prolonged series of reconnaissance missions across Europe under the cover of being a Japanese father-daughter pair on holiday. Their journey took them from Pyongyang to Moscow, and then on to Budapest, where they were provided with high-quality forged Japanese passports and new cover identities: Mayumi Hachiya and Shinichi Hachiya. These documents were so detailed that they could withstand casual inspection at international checkpoints. Their supposed European holiday was, in fact, the final rehearsal for what would become a devastating mission. They practiced switching languages and roles, meeting with North Korean operatives in secret, and avoiding surveillance. Their ultimate destination was Baghdad, where they were to finalize their preparations for a bombing operation that would be carried out in the skies over the Andaman Sea. The mission was presented to Kim as a service of the highest Ordera directive that, she was told, came from none other than Kim Jong-il himself. It would be her moment to fulfill everything she had trained for, the culmination of 7 years of preparation, and a supposed act of patriotism that would seal her place in the annals of North Korean heroism. But the weight of this assignment, though not fully apparent to her at the time, would eventually crush the carefully constructed identity of Hwa and resurrect the long-buried conscience of Kim Hyon hui. Her next steps would not only change her own fate but impact the lives of hundreds and ultimately draw global attention to the silent cruelties of North Korea's espionage apparatus. Part 3. Operation 858. Mission of No Return. By the autumn of 1987, Kim Hyon hui had been fully initiated into one of the most secretive and dangerous missions ever orchestrated by the North Korean regime. After nearly a decade of rigorous training, cultural immersion, false identities, and psychological transformation, she was handed her ultimate assignment tone that would irreversibly alter the trajectory of her life and claim the lives of 115 innocent civilians. This was not merely a test of her espionage skills, it was a deadly command issued from the highest echelons of North Korea's authoritarian hierarchy, allegedly bearing the handwritten signature of Kim Jong-il himself. Its aim was to disrupt the international standing of South Korea in a single, explosive stroke. The target was Korean Air Flight 858, a routine passenger flight scheduled to travel from Baghdad, Iraq to Seoul, South Korea, with stopovers in Abu Dhabi and Bangkok. But to the North Korean regime, this flight symbolized much more than civilian air travel. It was a symbolic artery of South Korean modernity and global integration. With South Korea poised to host the 1988 Summer Olympics, an event that would showcase the nation on the world stage, Pyongyang's leadership was determined to undermine this narrative of peace, prosperity, and legitimacy. Their answer came in the form of state-sponsored terrorism. To destroy Flight 858 in midair and attribute the attack to South Korean instability, Kim Hyon hui, operating under the alias Mayumi Hachia, and her co-agent, Kim Sung-il, posing as her father, Shinichi Hachia, embarked on the final leg of their mission disguised as a Japanese father-daughter tourist duo. With flawlessly forged Japanese passports, authentic mannerisms, and rehearsed familial chemistry, they began their covert journey across multiple countries, from North Korea to the Soviet Union, into Eastern Europe, and finally to the Middle East. This elaborate travel route was designed to obscure their trail and minimize the risk of detection by foreign intelligence agencies. In Belgrade, Yugoslavia, they rendezvoused with other North Korean operatives who provided them with the lethal components of their plana. Time-triggered explosive device, cleverly concealed within a portable Panasonic radio and an accompanying bottle of duty-free liquor filled with liquid explosives. This setup was chosen for its innocent appearance, designed to pass through airport security checks unnoticed. The radio, a common item among travelers, would raise no suspicions. The liquor bottle, carefully resealed, was an effective detonator. Together, these devices constituted the bomb that would bring down Flight 858. As they journeyed through airports and hotel lobbies, Kim's mind oscillated between strict focus and haunting uncertainty. Though deeply indoctrinated by years of training and loyal to the state's cause, she could not entirely silence the occasional flicker of moral hesitation. But her conditioning was strong. She reminded herself, as she had been taught, that the mission served the greater goal of reunifying the Korean peninsula under the North's ideology, and that the passengers aboard the plane were merely sacrifices in a righteous cause. In Baghdad, on November 28, 1987, Kim and her handler purchased tickets for Korean Air Flight 858. They boarded the plane and calmly took their seats like any other passengers. Carrying their deadly cargo disguised as innocent electronics and beverages, they acted with utmost precision. While on board, they stowed the radio and liquor bottle in the overhead luggage rack before the second leg of the flight. The timer had been set, the bomb was in place, and the countdown to tragedy had begun. Shortly after placing the bomb, Kim and Kim Song-il disembarked from the aircraft during its layover in Abu Dhabi. From there, they traveled to Bahrain, their next safe haven on the escape route. They were calm, composed, and outwardly unremarkable. No airport officials suspected that the two Japanese tourists had just planted a bomb that would soon claim more than 100 lives in an unspeakable act of terror. Meanwhile, Flight 858 continued on its scheduled journey. Somewhere over the Andaman Sea, without warning, the bomb detonated. The aircraft was torn apart in midair. All 115 passengers and crew members aboard were killed instantly. There were no survivors. The explosion left minimal physical evidence, complicating early investigative efforts. But the impact was immediate and global. Shockwaves were felt in diplomatic circles, intelligence communities, and among the families of victims from over half a dozen countries. What had been a calculated political strike was now an international tragedy. Back in Bahrain, things did not go as smoothly for the two agents as anticipated. Suspicious of their unusual travel patterns and the inconsistencies in their documentation, Bahraini authorities detained the pair for questioning. Initially, Kim and her companion maintained their fabricated identities. They spoke fluent Japanese, used their cover names, and presented their passports. However, as pressure mounted and inconsistencies emerged, such as Kim's Cantonese fluency conflicting with her claimed background from northern China, their cover began to unravel. Realizing that their arrest was imminent and their mission had been compromised, both operatives resorted to their final instruction: suicide. Each had been issued a concealed cyanide capsule, hidden inside what appeared to be a regular cigarette. This was the ultimate failsafe. If captured, they were to take their own lives, preventing any chance of interrogation and protecting the integrity of North Korea's intelligence network. In a swift and tragic move, Kim Song-il bit into his cyanide-laced cigarette. He convulsed and died within minutes. Kim Hyon hui attempted to follow suit, placing the capsule between her lips and preparing to bite. But in a moment that would change her life and history, a Bahraini police officer reacted quickly and snatched the cigarette from her mouth before she could fully ingest the poison. She was immediately hospitalized and kept under strict observation, her fate hanging in the balance. At first, Kim clung to her cover story. She insisted that she was Pai Chui Hui, a Chinese orphan who had grown up in Japan, and that she was simply traveling with an older man she had met. She denied any knowledge of or romantic involvement with her deceased partner, portraying herself as a naive traveler caught in a confusing situation. Her composure was impressive, but the inconsistencies in her language use, her behavior, and the evidence gathered from Flight 858 all painted a different picture. International investigators, particularly from South Korea, began piecing the puzzle together. With mounting evidence and diplomatic pressure, Bahraini authorities extradited Kim to South Korea. She was transported under extreme security, her wrists and ankles bound, her eyes covered, and her mouth gagged. For a woman trained never to be caught, it was a humiliating fall from elite operative to high-value prisoner. But the most profound transformation was yet to come. In Seoul, she was interrogated by South Korean intelligence and treated with surprising care. Contrary to what she had been taught in North Korea, that the South was a brutal American puppet state where defectors were tortured and civilians lived in squalor, Kim was shown a very different reality. Her interrogators played television programs, news segments, and documentaries that revealed the prosperity of South Korea, its freedom of speech, and the democratic institutions that guided its society. They took her on drives through Seoul, letting her glimpse its vibrant streets, clean neighborhoods, and well-dressed citizens. It was a carefully calculated move, aimed not only at extracting information but also at dismantling the ideological prison in her mind. This unexpected exposure created an emotional and psychological fracture within Kim. The more she saw, the more the dogma of her past began to erode. The foundation on which she had built her identity as an agent of the North was beginning to crumble. After 8 grueling days, she finally broke down. She confessed her real identity. She was Hyon hui, a North Korean citizen and trained spy, and she had planted the bomb on Flight 858. She further revealed that the operation had been authorized by Kim Jong-il himself, implicating the North Korean leadership directly in a campaign of international terrorism. That confession would reverberate throughout the world. Not only had South Korea captured a North Korean operative, a rare occurrence, but they had also obtained irrefutable evidence of Pyongyang's direct involvement in one of the worst airline bombings in history. For Kim, however, the confession was not just an intelligence victory for the South. It was the first step in her journey toward reckoning, guilt, and eventual redemption. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her transformation from loyal spy to penitent human being had only just begun. Part 4. Reckoning and Redemption. From Death, Sentence, to Second Life. In the early months of 1988, the world watched closely as one of the most significant and controversial legal proceedings in South Korean history unfolded in a courtroom in Seoul. At the center of it all stood Kim Hyon hui, a young woman whose face had once been unknown, now immortalized by tragedy. Just weeks earlier, she had confessed to planting a bomb on Korean Air Flight 858, resulting in the death of all 115 passengers and crew. Her arrest, confession, and the chilling clarity with which she described the plot had rocked the Korean peninsula and reverberated across the globe. Kim had arrived in South Korea under the tightest security possible. She had been blindfolded, shackled, and gagged throughout her extradition from Bahrain, a country that had no intention of harboring someone implicated in international terrorism. Upon arrival, she was immediately taken into the custody of the Agency for National Security Planning, ANSP, South Korea's leading intelligence agency. Her handlers anticipated a cold, combative interrogation reflective of her North Korean indoctrination. But what followed was something few had expected. Kim did not behave like a hardened ideologue. She did not exhibit the steely resistance or programmed silence often seen in North Korean operatives. Instead, she appeared quiet, introspective, and increasingly aware of her surroundings. South Korean intelligence officials had adopted a unique approach. Rather than torturing her, as she had been conditioned to expect, they showed her kindness, respect, and most subversively truth. They took her on supervised excursions around Seoul. She was shown clean streets, thriving businesses, open markets, and modern apartment blocks. She was allowed to watch television broadcasts, including news segments and entertainment programs that revealed a society far removed from the propaganda she had been taught to believe. In North Korea, she had been told that South Korea was a poverty-stricken colony of the United States, run by puppet officials and plagued by famine, crime, and moral decay. But what she saw in Seoul was prosperity, independence, and a degree of freedom that simply did not exist in the North. She watched as ordinary South Koreans criticized their government on talk shows without fear of arrest. She saw stores stocked with products she had never seen before, These simple, everyday realities slowly unraveled years of state-sponsored lies, and her inner defenses began to crack. On the 8th day of her detention, Kim finally broke down. Sitting across from her interrogators, she confessed everything. Her name, her mission, her training, her orders from Pyongyang laid it all bare. For South Korea, it was a stunning intelligence victory. Kim not only confirmed the North's direct involvement in the bombing, but she also named senior figures in the regime and described in detail the inner workings of their espionage apparatus. Her testimony was a political earthquake. With it, Seoul gained valuable insight into Pyongyang's intentions and methods, while also seizing the moral high ground on the international stage. But for Kim, the confession was something much deeper. It was not only a betrayal of the regime that had raised and trained Herod, was also a confrontation with the enormity of what she had done. In taking responsibility for the bombing, she began to feel the weight of 115 lost lives pressing down on her conscience. The people who had died on Flight 858 were not the faceless enemies her instructors had portrayed. They were civilians' mothers, fathers, children, and professionals flying home to loved ones or heading toward new opportunities. Her indoctrination had dehumanized them. But now, seeing their photos in newspapers and hearing the voices of their grieving families on television, the horror of her actions became undeniable. In March 1989, after a lengthy investigation and trial, Kim Hyon hui was sentenced to death by a South Korean court. The verdict was expected and, for many, necessary. The scope of her crime, the magnitude of the loss, demanded the harshest punishment under law. But something extraordinary happened soon after her conviction. Just months later, South Korean President Roh Tae-woo granted her a full pardon. It was a controversial and highly symbolic act. In his public statement, the president declared that Kim was not the true villain. She was, he argued, a manipulated Tula victim of brainwashing, used by the North Korean government to further its destructive goals. Rather than being a hardened criminal, she was portrayed as a young woman who had been denied agency, molded into a weapon by a state that erased individuality in pursuit of its own ideology. This pardon did not absolve Kim of guilt. It did not erase the pain of the victims' families or the stain on history. But it did offer her a second chance, a rare opportunity to step out of the shadows of her past and try to atone for what she had done. In the eyes of the South Korean government and many observers, her remorse was genuine. Her cooperation had been comprehensive, her testimony consistent and thorough. Most importantly, she had chosen to defect and remain in the South rather than return to the North, knowing that she would face certain execution if she did. After receiving her pardon, Kim was granted protection and allowed to start a new life in South Korea under tight surveillance. She was no longer an enemy of the state, but she was not a free woman either. Her existence remained precarious. The threat of retaliation from North Korea was very real. Pyongyang was known to hunt down defectors and dissidents abroad, especially those who had become public embarrassments or intelligence liabilities. Kim lived in constant fear of assassination, and to this day, her location remains undisclosed. Armed guards continue to accompany her, and she rarely makes public appearances without strict security arrangements. But rather than retreating into silence, Kim chose a different pathone of accountability, disclosure, and public engagement. She authored an autobiography titled The Tears of My Soul, published in both Korean and English. The book was an unflinching exploration of her life, from her childhood and training to the bombing and its aftermath. In it, she expressed deep regret for her actions, mourned the lives lost, and sought to expose the cruelty and manipulation of the North Korean regime. The proceeds from the book were donated to the families of the victims of Flight 858, a small gesture of penance, but one that signaled her determination to seek redemption. The reception to her autobiography was mixed. Some praised her candor and her bravery in revealing the truth. Others viewed the book as a calculated attempt to rehabilitate her image. Some victims' families accepted her apology, while others could never bring themselves to forgive her. The emotional wound left by the bombing was simply too deep, and yet, Kim persisted in her efforts to speak out. In interviews with international journalists, human rights organizations, and documentary filmmakers, she consistently expressed her sorrow, condemned the North Korean government, and warned the world of the dangers posed by authoritarian indoctrination. In one particularly emotional interview with Washington Post correspondent Don Oberdorfer, Kim described how she had once believed that the bombing of Flight 858 was a necessary sacrificial strategic act that would accelerate the unification of the Korean peninsula under the North's control. But after seeing the truth about South Korea's prosperity, its freedoms, its vibrant society, she came to understand that her mission had not only failed but had been morally indefensible. "I committed the crime of killing compatriots," she said, her voice heavy with grief. That realization would haunt her for the rest of her life. Kim's transformation from trained killer to regretful survivor challenged the simplistic narratives often assigned to perpetrators of terror. She had been a tool of a brutal regime, yes, but she had also made choices, some of them conscious and devastating. The tension between guilt and victimhood followed her everywhere. Over the years, she made several appearances on national television, especially when North Korea-related incidents drew global attention. Her insights were often sought during periods of heightened tension on the Korean peninsula. But no matter the setting, her interviews always circled back to remorse, accountability, and the impossibility of fully escaping one's past. One of the most poignant moments in her post-defection life came when she met with the family of Yaeko Taguchi, the Japanese woman who had once been her Japanese language instructor in North Korea. Kim had long believed that Taguchi had been executed by the North, but upon learning that her fate remained uncertain, she expressed a wish to help. In 2010, she traveled to Japan to meet Taguchi's family, delivering what little information she had and expressing her sorrow for not being able to do more. Her visit drew media attention and reignited debate over the Japanese citizens abducted by North Korea in the 1970s and 1980s. As the years passed, Kim faded somewhat from public view, retreating into the anonymity afforded by the South Korean government. She married a former South Korean intelligence officer who had been involved in her debriefing and reintegration. Together, they raised 2 children in an undisclosed location. She continued to live under round-the-clock protection, knowing that the threat from the North would likely never disappear. Despite this, she occasionally resurfaced to offer commentary on North Korea's leadership, particularly during moments of crisis or global focus on the regime's nuclear ambitions. Yet, even as she offered political insights, Kim never let go of the moral weight she carried. In interviews, she often returned to the lives lost on Flight 858. She could never forget the faces of the victims, many of whom she had never seen until after their deaths. Their stories, their families, their dreams all extinguished in an instant. It was a burden she bore with quiet anguish, and one she believed she could never fully repay. In the eyes of some, Kim Hyon hui would always be the woman who planted a bomb on a civilian aircraft. But in the eyes of others, she became a complex symbol of indoctrination, remorse, and redemption, a survivor who turned against the regime that had created her and devoted her second life to speaking out against the system that had once taught her how to kill. Part 5. A Voice Among Shadows. The Pen, the Past, and Public Perception. After being pardoned in 1989 and granted a second chance at life, Hyon hui entered a new and uncertain phase of existence. She was no longer a prisoner, nor an active agent, nor even a citizen with a publicly known address. She had become something else entirely, a living symbol, a controversial figure caught between the roles of perpetrator and victim, condemned and pitied, feared and studied. In this new life, her only clear compass was the need to reckon publicly with what she had done, and perhaps to redefine who she could be. The first major step in this transformation came through writing. In the early 1990s, Kim collaborated with a South Korean publisher to write her memoir, titled The Tears of My Soul. The title itself evoked both sorrow and ownership, signaling not only grief for what had happened, but also her own culpability. The book was not written as a mere collection of memories. It was an unflinching confessional that began with her indoctrinated childhood and concluded with her emotional collapse in a soul interrogation room. With precise, almost clinical detail, she laid out the stages of her transformation, the years of training, the techniques of manipulation, the chilling obedience she developed, and the moment when all of that conditioning finally cracked. In The Tears of My Soul, Kim did not attempt to minimize her actions. She did not offer justifications or excuses for the Korean Air Flight 858 bombing. Instead, she focused on the path that had led her to that moment, a path paved with lies, ideological brainwashing, isolation from the outside world, and a loss of individual thought. Her memoir made clear that while she had been a tool of the regime, she had also been human, capable of guilt, memory, and moral pain. That blend of confession and self-awareness made her book emotionally powerful and, for some readers, painfully unsettling. Kim's decision to donate all of the proceeds from her memoir to the families of the Flight 858 victims was another expression of her personal responsibility. She knew that no sum of money could ever restore the lives that had been taken or ease the pain of those left behind. Yet this gesture was deeply symbolic. It was one of the only ways she could communicate, in action rather than words, her deep sorrow for what had occurred. It was also a form of atonement, though ever small and incomplete, for a crime that would otherwise remain unforgivable in many eyes. The book's release, however, was met with mixed reactions. Some readers praised her honesty, bravery, and apparent remorse. They saw a woman trying to make sense of a life that had been hijacked by ideology and then shattered by reality. Others, however, were not so forgiving. To them, Kim remained a terrorist, no matter how eloquent her apologies or how tragic her backstory. Reviews from international media reflected this divide. In a 1,992 review of Eileen McDonald's book Shoot the Women First, Publishers Weekly referred to Kim as robot-like, noting her blind submission to male authority and state commands. The review echoed a sentiment felt by many, that Kim's life had been defined by passivity and surrender, not courage or redemption. Still, the memoir made an impact. In South Korea, where anti-communist sentiment ran high and memories of the bombing were still fresh, Kim's transformation was studied with fascination and unease. Her story offered a unique window into the secretive world of North Korean espionage, but it also challenged easy narratives about guilt and innocence. Was she merely a victim of indoctrination? Or was she responsible for the deaths of 115 innocent people? Could the two identities coexist? In the years that followed, Kim began to speak publicly in interviews, rarely and cautiously at first, but with increasing depth and openness over time. She appeared on television programs and gave written interviews to major news outlets. One of the most widely cited conversations was her interview with the Washington Post's Don Oberdorfer. In it, she shared how deeply she had once believed in her mission. The bombing of Flight 858 had not seemed like murder to her at the time. It had been presented as an act of patriotic duty that would help bring the Korean peninsula closer to reunification under the leadership of the North. She had seen the passengers not as human beings but as obstacles, casualties of a necessary political victory. But then she saw Seoul. It was that experience, the tour of the South Korean capital arranged by her interrogators, that permanently altered her worldview. She saw people living in freedom, dressed well, laughing in restaurants, shopping in stores overflowing with goods. She saw a society that was not impoverished or oppressed, but alive and vibrant. This was not the South Korea she had been taught to hate. This was not the enemy. And in that moment, she said, she realized the gravity of her crime. "I had committed the crime of killing compatriots," she told Oberdorfer, her voice heavy with shame. For the first time, she said, she understood that those people on the plane were not faceless enemies. They were Koreans. They were her people. That realization haunted her, but it also motivated her. She came to believe that her voice, however damaged, could serve a purpose, not as a symbol of violence, but as a warning. She began participating in documentaries and giving advice to intelligence agencies and journalists trying to understand the opaque world of the Kim regime. She spoke about the psychological manipulation used by Pyongyang to create unwavering loyalty. She explained the complex indoctrination methods used to transform ordinary citizens into willing operatives, and she cautioned the world against underestimating North Korea's ruthlessness. Over time, she developed a reputation as an unlikely expert on North Korean internal affairs, particularly regarding the regime's training programs and mindset. During the 2013 Korean Peninsula crisis, Kim appeared on Australian television to offer her perspective on the leadership of Kim Jong-un. She described him as too young and inexperienced, someone who was struggling to gain complete control over the military and win their loyalty. She also warned that the nuclear weapons program was not simply a threat, it was a bargaining chip, designed to extract aid from the international community while uniting the North Korean public under the illusion of national strength. Despite these public appearances, Kim never sought fame. Every interview, every publication, every sighting was accompanied by increased threats to her life. The North Korean government, which had long denied that she was one of their own, considered her a traitor. She was a living embarrassment, a voice of exposure and truth. The risk of assassination or abduction was ever present. Kim lived with this danger daily, often changing locations and remaining under the protection of South Korean security forces. To this day, her exact whereabouts remain a closely guarded secret. The personal toll was immense. The trauma of her early life, her years of isolation, and the immense guilt she carried affected her relationships and her emotional health. Yet despite this, she continued to engage with the world in cautious but determined ways. She granted interviews to organizations advocating for abductee families, offered support to defectors, and lent her voice to efforts aimed at highlighting North Korea's human rights abuses. Her commentary often extended beyond political analysis. In 2017, in an interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun, Kim offered insight into the assassination of Kim Jong-nam, the estranged half-brother of Kim Jong-un. She noted that the use of 2 Southeast Asian women to carry out the murder rather than trained operatives was intentional. It was designed to make the victim lower his guard. The analysis was not just forensic. It revealed her continued understanding of the regime's psychological warfare and its evolving tactics. But no matter how far she traveled from her past, the events of November 1987 followed her like a shadow. Public forgiveness, if it existed, was never universal. Some family members of the victims refused to accept her remorse. Others believed her transformation was genuine but still found it impossible to reconcile with their grief. Kim understood this. In interviews, she often said that she did not expect forgiveness-only understanding. For Kim Hyon hui, the pen had become her only real weapon, not one of destruction, but of witness. She had used it to tell the truth, to expose the inner workings of one of the world's most repressive regimes and to attempt to repay a debt that could never be settled. Through her book, her interviews, and her cautious activism, she emerged not as a hero or a villain, but as something more difficult to define. A survivor of her own past, bearing testimony to a system that turned people into instruments, and hoping that her voice, once used to destroy, might now serve to prevent. Part 6. A Witness Across Borders. Taguchi, Japan, and the Quiet Acts of Grace. Years after her defection and public confession, Kim Hyon hui's past continued to pull her into the lives of others, people she had never intended to harm but who were nonetheless shaped by the dark machinery that once controlled her. Among them were the families of Japanese citizens abducted by North Korea during the 1970s and 1980s. One such case was Yaeko Taguchi, whose fate became intertwined with Kim's during her time as a trainee spy. During her years at the clandestine training facility outside Pyongyang, Kim had been assigned a Japanese language tutor, known only to her as Lee Un-hye. The woman was patient, soft-spoken, and kinda stark contrast to the brutal rigidity of the surrounding system. She taught Kim not only grammar and pronunciation, but also cultural nuance, idioms, and behavior pattern skills that would later enable Kim to convincingly pose as a Japanese tourist. Only after her defection did Kim learn that her teacher had been Yaeko Taguchi, a Japanese woman kidnapped by North Korean agents and forced into a life of confinement and coercion. Kim's revelation that Taguchi was alive years after her abduction gave the Taguchi family renewed hope. For decades, they had been pressing the Japanese government for information about Yaeko's fate, often in the face of denial or diplomatic silence from Pyongyang. Kim became a critical eyewitness, the only person who had not only seen Taguchi in North Korea but had lived and trained alongside her. In March 2009, Kim met with Yaeko Taguchi's family in a deeply emotional and symbolic encounter. She described Taguchi's personality, her voice, her habit of singing lullaby small memories that meant everything to the family. Kim conveyed that Taguchi had longed for her children and spoke often of home. These details, though simple, were more than the family had received in decades. For them, Kim was a messenger from a sealed world, offering the last known glimpse into their loved one's life. The meeting led to Kim's visit to Japan in July 2010, an event made possible only through tight security coordination between South Korean and Japanese authorities. It marked a rare moment in diplomatic history. An ex-North Korean agent, once sentenced to death for mass murder, now welcomed as a witness in the service of truth and closure. During her visit, Kim met other abductee families, appeared in press interviews, and helped raise public awareness around the plight of North Korean abduction victims. Despite the risks to her safety, Kim saw the trip as a moral responsibility. For her, it wasn't about politics or even redemption. It was about bearing witness. If her memories could bring peace or direction to even one family, then perhaps some part of her past might be repurposed into something meaningful. In the following year, as Japan faced one of its greatest modern tragedies, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, Kim made another quiet but poignant gesture. She donated 1 million yen, around $15,600 USD, to disaster relief efforts. It was not a grand political statement, but a personal expression of gratitude. Japan had treated her with surprising respect and dignity during her visit. Her donation, she explained, was an attempt to give something back to a people who had offered her kindness in the face of her violent past. Kim's connection to the Taguchi case also gained renewed attention through a Japanese television documentary that dramatized her life. The film highlighted her years of training, her interactions with Taguchi, and the emotional toll of her mission. In one particularly moving scene, Taguchi, portrayed by an actress, sings a lullaby in the training camp, symbolizing the mother she once was and the children she had been torn from. These dramatizations, while fictionalized, were rooted in Kim's testimony, and they reignited public interest in the fate of Japan's abductees. Despite her gestures of contrition and remembrance, Kim remained under no illusions. The North Korean government continued to deny her past and publicly insisted that she had never been a citizen of the DPRK. Pro-regime schools in Japan even claimed her entire biography was South Korean propaganda. Meanwhile, the threat of retribution against her remained real and constant. She continued to live in hiding, with government-provided protection, changing residences and appearances to evade possible assassins. Still, Kim stood firm in her belief that sharing the truth about Taguchi, about North Korea, about what had been done in secret, was her duty. She knew she could not bring back the lives lost, or erase her own role in their absence. But through memory, testimony, and empathy, she sought to ensure they were not forgotten. Part 7. Life in the Shadows. Silence, Survival, and Speaking Out. Even after her public pardon and transformation into a symbol of remorse, Hyon hui never truly found peace. Though she no longer wore prison chains or sat in interrogation rooms, the threat that loomed over her life remained constant. Her status as a high-profile defectorone who had publicly exposed the darkest tactics of the North Korean regime made her a marked target. Living under the shadow of potential assassination became her new normal, a quiet war she continued to fight each day. After her pardon, Kim was placed under a strict protection program by South Korean authorities. She was given a new name, a new identity, and an undisclosed location to live in. Her whereabouts were a carefully guarded secret, known to only a handful of people. Around-the-clock surveillance became routine, and armed security guards were never far from sight. Her home, wherever it was, functioned more like a fortified outpost than a domestic refuge. The threat against her was not abstract. North Korea had a long history of targeting dissidents, defectors, and former operatives it viewed as traitors. Kim's detailed testimony and international visibility made her an embarrassment to the regime. She had not only defected, she had exposed. She had named names, described training procedures, and given the world an intimate glimpse into the inner machinery of North Korean espionage. Her revelations regarding Yaeko Taguchi and the abduction program struck an especially raw nerve, undermining Pyongyang's international denials and damaging its diplomatic posture with Japan. In the eyes of the Kim dynasty, she was not just a defector, she was a defiant voice who had slipped through their fingers' sand they never forgot. Despite the risk, Kim did not completely vanish from public life. In fact, she made a conscious decision to continue speaking out, offering insights into North Korean leadership, military behavior, and intelligence tactics. While her public appearances were infrequent, they were strategically timed, typically during periods of heightened tension on the Korean peninsula or international crises involving Pyongyang. One such occasion was in 2013, during a particularly volatile phase of nuclear brinkmanship between North Korea and the international community. Kim appeared on Australian television to discuss Kim Jong-un, the young and newly appointed leader of the regime. She was frank in her analysis, describing him as too young and inexperienced, and suggesting he was struggling to earn the loyalty of the powerful military establishment. "He is not yet in complete control," she explained, "and that makes him more dangerous." She warned that the regime's aggressive nuclear posture was not simply about war, it was a carefully calculated strategy of survival. By creating the illusion of threat, Kim Jong-un could rally internal support, deter external intervention, and extract international aid. "The nuclear program," she said, "is a bargaining chip. It is how the regime keeps the people in line and the world at bay." Her words, delivered with calm clarity, were treated as valuable intelligence by foreign policy experts, journalists, and diplomats trying to navigate the opaque logic of Pyongyang. Kim's rare public appearances, served a dual purpose. On one hand, they offered unique first-hand knowledge that no think tank or satellite imagery could replicate. She had lived the indoctrination, trained with real agents, and knew how the regime crafted obedience. On the other hand, her appearances also reaffirmed her defiantian implicit message to North Korea that she would not be silenced, even if doing so meant living behind locked doors and under permanent surveillance. Her interviews were always carefully managed. She never appeared without authorization, and all logistics from her transportation to the location of filming were coordinated with intelligence agencies. Her face was often partially obscured, and sometimes her voice was modulated or translated through subtitles. The risk of identification remained high. Even decades after her defection, she could not risk routine activities, grocery shopping, using a credit card, sending her children to school under their real names. Her life was lived in the margins, camouflaged by necessity. In a 2017 interview with Japan's Mainichi Shimbun, Kim once again demonstrated her enduring insight into North Korean operations. Discussing the shocking assassination of Kim Jong-nam, the estranged half-brother of Kim Jong-un, she pointed out that the murder was designed with cunning psychological manipulation. 2 Southeast Asian women who were not trained agents had been used to deliver the fatal VX nerve agent at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Kim noted that this was likely a calculated move. "Using amateurs made the victim let down his guard," she said. "If he had sensed he was being targeted by professionals, he would have taken precautions." Her comment underscored the regime's evolving tactics, more deceptive, more disposable, and harder to trace. Kim also weighed in on North Korea's strategic use of international events. When Pyongyang extended an olive branch ahead of the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, sending athletes and a high-level delegation to South Korea, many hoped it was a sign of thawing tensions. Kim, however, was skeptical. In an interview with the BBC, she stated plainly that North Korea is pretending to be friendly, but the nuclear program remains their true priority. She warned that the overtures were diplomatic theater, aimed at buying time and softening international resolve while the regime continued to develop its weapons capabilities in secret. These statements, delivered with the quiet authority of lived experience, cemented Kim's status as a reluctant but essential figure in understanding North Korea. Despite the years that had passed since the bombing, her voice still resonated. She was one of the few people alive who had crossed over and lived to tell the story not as a political defector seeking asylum, but as someone who had been built by the regime, used by it, and ultimately broken free from it. Yet her public service came at a deeply personal cost. The fear of retaliation never left her. Intelligence reports indicated that agents had been dispatched in past years with orders to silence her. As a result, Kim continued to change residences frequently and avoid any patterns in her routine. Her children, born in South Korea and raised under assumed identities, had to grow up in a world where their mother's past was a secret too dangerous to tell. In quieter moments, Kim admitted to the emotional toll of her hidden life. The isolation, the anxiety, the guilt all of it remained present, even as she tried to move forward. She had long accepted that she could never live a normal life. She would never walk freely down a crowded street or travel abroad without risk. Her past was too visible, and her story too potent. But despite this, she remained committed to her role as a voice of warning a survivor with a duty to speak. In the end, Kim Hyon hui lived not in freedom, but in a kind of suspended purgatory, no longer a captive of North Korea, yet not entirely free in the South. Her protection was not a luxury, it was a sentence. But within that narrow space of safety and secrecy, she found purpose. She chose to keep speaking, even if her voice could never reach those who needed to hear it, most the ones still trapped behind North Korea's borders. Part 8. Denial and Disinformation. the battle over identity and truth. Even as Kim Hyon hui continued to live a life defined by reflection, secrecy, and guarded commentary, her very identity remained a source of fierce dispute, especially by the state that had once created her. In the years following her defection and confession, the North Korean government launched an aggressive and sustained campaign of denial. Pyongyang insisted that Kim had never existed as one of its citizens, let alone as an elite intelligence operative. According to the regime's official narrative, Kim Hyon hui was nothing more than a fiction, fabricated by South Korea and its allies as part of an elaborate propaganda campaign. This denial extended beyond public statements. North Korean officials described the Korean Air Flight 858 bombing as a false flag operation orchestrated by the South to discredit the North in the lead-up to the 1988 Seoul Olympics. In this telling, Kim was either an actress or a brainwashed pawn, coached by South Korean intelligence to impersonate a North Korean spy. Despite overwhelming evidence, including her own confession, corroborated intelligence, and physical documentation, North Korea refused to acknowledge any involvement in the bombing or any association with Kim herself. The state media repeated this version of events with typical fervor. In official press releases, speeches at the United Nations, and internal broadcasts, the name Kim Hyon hui was treated not as a person, but as a constructone of many tools in the South's supposed psychological warfare arsenal. The sheer scale of the denial was not unusual for Pyongyang, which had long used information control and historical revisionism as central pillars of its governance. But in Kim's case, the campaign of denial was particularly aggressive, reflecting how deeply her defection had wounded the regime. Part of what made Kim such a dangerous figure in the eyes of the North was not just her betrayal, but her visibility. Unlike most defectors who disappeared quietly into new lives, Kim had become a globally recognized figure. Her memoir, interviews, and testimonies exposed the inner workings of North Korea's most secret institutions. She had given names, described facilities, recounted training exercises, and connected the dots between the espionage world and the regime's ruling elite. Most damningly, she had directly linked Kim Jong-il to the bombing operation, asserting that it was his handwritten directive that launched the mission to destroy Flight 858. In response, North Korea did not simply deny Kim's identity. It attempted to erase her entirely. In schools operated by pro-North Korean organizations in Japan, teachers told students that Kim was a South Korean imposter, part of an elaborate lie designed to smear the North. The bombing was described either as fiction or as a frame job. Textbooks made no mention of her. In the DPRK itself, her name could not be spoken. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge a fundamental breach in the regime's aura of invincibility. An agent so thoroughly trained, so deeply loyal, had defected and turned into the regime's greatest liability. This total denial had profound implications. For Kim, it was a painful reminder that her past, so deeply embedded in North Korea's machinery, had been rendered invisible. The people who had trained her, the compounds she had lived in, the missions she had rehearsed, none of it was acknowledged. It was as though her former life had been wiped away. The emotional effect of this erasure was difficult to describe. She often said in interviews that while she was grateful for the chance to begin anew, she remained haunted by the fact that her very existence was treated as a lie by the country of her birth. For those advocating for the truth, especially the families of bombing victims and Japanese abductees, North Korea's denials only deepened the pain. The regime's refusal to acknowledge Kim's testimony meant that many questions remained unanswered. What had happened to abductees like Yaiko Taguchi? Who had authorized the bombings? And why? Would anyone in Pyongyang ever be held accountable? As long as Kim Hyon hui was treated as a fabrication, those who depended on her memories to make sense of their losses were trapped in a political standoff that offered no justice. Yet even in the face of these denials, Kim's story endured. Her public presence, though carefully managed, remained a challenge to the North's narrative. With every interview and statement, she reminded the world that she had lived the life North Korea said didn't exist. She had spoken its language, eaten its food, believed in its mission, and ultimately rejected its truth. Her very survival, her continued existence as a living witness, was itself an act of resistance. And for Pyongyang, that was intolerable. In many ways, Kim's story reflected the larger conflict between North Korea's obsessive control over information and the uncontrollable nature of truth. The regime could rewrite textbooks, threaten defectors, and shape internal reality, but it could not erase the memories carried by those who had escaped. And Kim, with her singular past, represented one of the most comprehensive and damning accounts of North Korea's secret operations. Despite the constant denials, her knowledge remained useful and respected in intelligence circles. South Korean and Japanese authorities continued to consult her for historical insight. She had become, almost unintentionally, an archive of Pyongyang's tactics, an encyclopedic witness to a regime that never documented its worst deeds. Her words, though denied in the North, were printed, translated, and cited across the democratic world. Still, the denial campaign took a personal toll. It wasn't just her life that had been erased by North Korea, it was her family's as well. According to multiple reports, her remaining relatives in the North were arrested shortly after her defection. Many were likely sent to political prison camps, gulags, where torture, starvation, and execution were routine. In interviews, Kim often spoke with visible grief about their fate. Though she had not intended for them to suffer, she knew that in the logic of the regime, guilt was inherited. Her freedom had cost them everything. In the years since, Kim has lived with this burden, disowned by the land that raised her, feared by the one that protects her, and vilified by a state that insists she never existed. But her memories persist unwritten in North Korea's history books, but etched in the public record for the rest of the world. Through her, a sliver of that secretive nation's darkest truths continues to surface, refusing to be denied. Part 9. A Life Rewritten. Family, Memory, and the Long Shadow of the Past. By the late 1990s, Kim Hyon hui had lived multiple lifetime siege, distinct, each impossible to separate from the other. She had been a child of privilege in Pyongyang, a celebrated student turned actress, a spy trained for sabotage, and a convicted terrorist turned remorseful witness. She had confessed to a crime that claimed 115 lives, been spared death by a political pardon, and spent years navigating the invisible fault lines between justice, guilt, and survival. And then, quietly and away from the glare of television cameras, she began something entirely different, a family. In 1997, Kim married the one person who may have understood her better than anyone else, a former South Korean intelligence officer who had worked on her debriefing after her arrest and extradition. He had seen her at her most fragile and disoriented, had studied her testimony, and come to believe in the authenticity of her remorse. Their relationship, initially professional and cautious, evolved over time into something personal and deeply human. In him, Kim found not only a protector but a partner, someone who didn't flinch at her past and who accepted her complicated present. The couple eventually had 2 children. For Kim, motherhood brought an entirely new dimension to her life, one she had never imagined during her years inside the North's intelligence apparatus. The very idea of raising children had once seemed incompatible with her existence. As a spy, she had been taught that family ties were liabilities, distractions from duty, and weaknesses to be exploited by the enemy. But as she cradled her children and watched them grow, she began to grasp the depth of what had been stolen from her, and perhaps even more painfully, what she had once stolen from others. Raising children under such unusual circumstances came with profound challenges. Kim and her husband had to raise their family in total secrecy. The risk of reprisal from North Korea remained ever present. Intelligence sources believed that her defection had led to severe punishment for her remaining family members in the North, some reportedly imprisoned in political labor camps. Knowing this, Kim lived with a constant sense of loss and guilt. She could never call her mother. She could not send letters or photos. The people who had raised her had been erased from her life, and she from theirs. In turn, her children were born into a world without a visible past. They grew up under assumed names, attended schools discreetly, and could never fully explain who their mother was or why their home was constantly watched. For Kim, this secrecy was the price of protection. But as a mother, it was also a quiet agony. She wanted her children to live normal lives, free from the weight of her history, yet every measure of safety reminded her that their world could never be ordinary. And yet, in the midst of this secrecy, Kim found moments of peace. Her family became a small sanctuary, a space where she was not defined by her former code name OK Hwa, or by her passport alias Mayumi Hachiya, but by something simple and redemptive: mother. It was a role that could not undo the past, but it allowed her to build something outside of it. She cooked meals, helped with schoolwork, and did what she could to create a childhood for her children that was free from fear, even if only within the walls of their guarded home. Despite the invisible fences around her life, Kim occasionally resurfaced in public, offering rare interviews or written statements when North Korean issues dominated headlines. But more often, she stayed silent, preferring to retreat into her private world. Those who met her in later years often described her as soft-spoken, careful, and reflective, a woman shaped by violence, but not defined solely by it. In private, she carried a weight that few could truly understand. Every anniversary of the Korean Air Flight 858 bombing brought a new wave of grief. She remembered the victims, some by name, others by face, and all by the silence they had left behind. In interviews, she often said she did not expect forgiveness. She only hoped that by telling the truth, by remembering, by refusing to let the regime's secrets disappear into history, she could offer something to the families who had lost so much. She also never stopped thinking about Yeiko Taguchi, a Japanese woman who had taught her a language that would one day disguise her into a killer, yet also prepared her to speak the truth to the world. Kim continued to hope that Taguchi might still be alive somewhere in North Korea, though decades had passed since they last saw each other. If nothing else, she wanted her former teacher's children to know that their mother had been brave, loving, and dignified even in captivity. As time passed, Kim's name faded from the headlines. New crises with North Korea emerged. New defectors offered insights. But among those who study the Korean conflict, her story remained singular. She was the rarest of witnesses, a woman who had been fully shaped by the regime and had turned against it not for political gain, but because she had seen, at last, what truth looked like. Her transformation did not absolve her of guilt, nor did she ever ask for such absolution, but it made her human in a way that ideology could never suppress. Today, Kim Hyon hui continues to live under protection in South Korea, her exact location known to only a select few. She does not seek attention. She does not appear in documentaries or give keynote speeches. Her focus is her family, her safety, and the quiet life she has managed to build from the ruins of her past. Her story remains unfinished, not because she has more to confess, but because the ripples of what she did, what she saw, and what she survived continue to move through history. The tragedy of Flight 858 will never be forgotten. But neither should the story of the woman who once brought it down and then chose to carry its memory in full view of the world, not as a monster or a martyr, but as a mother, a witness, and a survivor.